The Supreme Court ruled on Friday that Maryland parents who have religious objections can pull their children from public school lessons using LGBTQIA content and curriculum. What's going on with that? Next, gun violence. What is the state of Maryland doing to lead the charge in America to collect data on what we see in terms of gun violence? We already know the White House has been cutting funding in key offices that have been doing that in the prior administration. Let's see what Maryland is doing to set the charge. Next, Governor Wes Moore has implemented a state hiring freeze in Maryland. What does that mean when it pertains to state jobs, when it pertains to our budget, most importantly, how we are moving our state forward? Next, the Tenant Bill of Rights. Why your rights matter, especially in this monumental implementation of legislation we have seen in the last legislative cycle. What does it all mean? Check it out. Finally, foreign policy. Why the U.S. Senate vetoed War Powers Bill brought forth by Tim Kaine and how this is going to impact us, especially if we keep backing countries like Israel. Let's tune in for another episode of D Nations. What's going on, everybody? I hope everybody is doing well. It's your boy Dorian. I know it's been hot. It's been humid. You've probably been sweating just like I've been sweating, but it's okay. Just continue to stay hydrated. Keep those giant bottles of water. It's actually funny. I was driving in Prince George's County yesterday near Capitol Heights, and this car, there was a truck that was carrying a car on, one of those like little freighters. Thing snapped, and the car just rolled down and hit a Jeep. Didn't hit my car. Everybody was safe, but it was a sight to see. But with all that being said, I appreciate each and every one of y'all for showing love, for continuing to like, subscribe, follow. Let's continue to expand D Nations. These Meanwhile on Monday segments are going to be focusing on our great state of Maryland. Because I'm going to keep it real with y'all. I feel like I don't be seeing podcasts, I don't be seeing content that's solely focused on Maryland news, what's going on across our state, right? Granted, you can turn on the TV and look at the news, but let's do it in a podcast format. I feel like there are podcasts out there, and if there's any, please send it to me. But the ones that I've seen, they don't really carry on. I feel like they kind of cut short after April. Maybe legislative session, probably. I guess. I don't know. But let's keep it round the clock. And so I'm gonna try my hardest. But if you have something that you can offer, something that you want to bring to the table for D Nations, come on board. Check the link in my bio. Fill out the guest panelist form. Ouch. Sorry, I just hit my head. But all that being said, let's dive in. So on Friday, the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States, had a decision to make whether or not Montgomery County Public Schools we're able to require students to take content when it pertains to an inclusive curriculum, particularly within the LGBTQIA content. It was brought forth in a 6-3 decision in Mahmoud versus Taylor that grants the groups of parents a preliminary injunction as their lawsuit continues to play out. Now, here's the thing. In its decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery County Public Schools must notify parents and guardians and allow them to opt their children out of reading books that contain LGBTQIA inclusive content. Now, I'm just going to tell you right out the bat, for those who think this decision was a good idea, you are setting the precedent for selective education, especially if you're calling it based off of religious freedom and religious intent and religious reasoning, because quite frankly, you're selecting which stories to tell in our United States history. It's not erasing the people that are in the community. You're erasing what it is that people need to know about when it pertains to their fellow neighbor, when it pertains to how we got here in American history, where inclusiveness is supposed to matter, where diversity is what's supposed to be our strength, what equity is supposed to look like in a framework of policy and in a framework of being a decent human being, regardless of your religion. And so when I hear about this decision, of course, 6-3 split down the line between the conservative justices that tend to vote conservative and the liberal justices that tend to vote liberal. It is what it is, really. It looks like. I mean, it looks like, again, we are selecting which histories to tell, and we're setting a dangerous precedent when it pertains to what it is that our kids we're trying to control in terms of what our kids learn. And I can't help but wonder. It's like, well, If they can opt out of books like that, what's stopping them from opting out of other materials through books that tell our American story? I think about 1963, for example, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where oftentimes we talk about the traditional figures such as Martin Luther King, such as John Lewis. We don't talk about some of the figures that we don't often hear about, especially when we talk about our intersectional history. One of those figures that come to my mind, and there's countless, but one of those figures is Bayard Rustin's, the brainchild of the March on Washington, created the blueprints for it. If it wasn't for him, you would not have a successful March on Washington. His story is fundamental and crucial when talking about the civil rights movement, especially when we talk about books. But what's alarming is with this decision, who's to say that a parent cannot say that they don't want their kid to learn about the story of someone like Bayard Rustin just because he was a gay black man? And some people will say, well, that's a stretch. You can tell the story without talking about his sexual orientation. Can you? Especially when, and this is coming from someone who not only has been privileged to grow up in Montgomery County, to go to school in Montgomery County, and to even teach in Montgomery County, being alongside my intersectional classmates, I can tell you that students want to see themselves in the history books based on their diverse backgrounds, based on their intersectional backgrounds. And it's mind-boggling that people think this is really a good idea. And some of the reactions that I've been seeing from leaders, and this is from an article I saw on CBS, they took a comment from our Attorney General Anthony Brown, and he expressed his disappointment after the Supreme Court decision, as he should, saying that these materials help teachers create classrooms where all students can thrive and feel safe, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. You also have it where the political parties, that we've heard that before. People are so oblivious to what's going on. And I hope that from this Supreme Court decision, uh, leaders in Montgomery County, whether it's elected leaders, whether it's leaders of nonprofit organizations, uh, and quite frankly, just community in general, come together to really stand behind what diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion looks like, even when you have a federal administration that is trying to target and weaponize and divide us, making it seem like those words are evil, making it seem like those words make us the problem as diverse peoples. And so, again, I hope that we really pay attention to how this precedent in this court is dividing what America is supposed to look like. I've done a lot of work with this case through working with my partners, with close allies of mine that were fundamental in advocating for all of our children. I have to give a shout out to Trans Maryland. I have to give a shout out to PFLAG. I have to give a shout out to organizations that are in the trenches each and every single day, right? But we have to step up. I need all of our organizations to step up. Even if you can't be on the front lines, what are you doing to push it in your communities? What are you doing to push it in the networks of your organizations? We gotta do better, y'all. Because we can't be performative. We can. This should scare a lot of people. This is your children. Again, even if you don't agree, we're standing on what our history looks like, what our communities are made up of. Diverse people, your neighbors. We have to do better. Next, we're going to talk about gun violence. Now, it's crazy because we've seen this crisis continue to unfold across America, where gun violence is the number one killer of youth in America. Gun violence is the number one killer of youth in Maryland. And I have to talk about the federal government in this because from the last administration, the Biden-Harris administration, you saw the creation of its first and hopefully not last Office of Gun Violence Prevention, right? This was coordinated as a response to not just mass shootings, but to gun violence that takes place across America, following by various pieces of legislation, such as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, such as expanding the needs for background checks for efforts to tackle ghost guns, right, that are unmarked, and fund and provide grants to community intervention and mental health resources, right? This was almost $438 million of our taxpayer dollars going to actual good use, right, under the last administration. And through that, you also have resources to collect data, data. And actually, the Department of Justice, I was reading an article where they reported a 17% drop in homicides from January to June 2024 versus the same period in 2023, which that's effort. That's your tax dollars actually going to good use, right? Reducing gun violence and mass shootings by almost 20%, right? That's a reduction. That was under the prior administration by Biden and Harris. And it's funny because now that we have a complete reversal in administrations where you have a bonehead in office, yes, I said it like it is, right? In January of 2025, Donald Trump uh, called for the closing of this office that was spearheaded by the executive branch. I mean, that's I mean, can't be surprised. I mean, obviously, it cannot be surprised, especially given the rhetoric of the Republican Party, especially with this nut in office. But, something that has still impressed me is how Maryland has continued to charge forth in ensuring that not just our youth and our communities are safe, but most importantly, we're collecting the data so that way we're providing comprehensive legislation that's implemented, that we're building on itself more so, and that we can match the dollars to where it needs to be. Because as a Marylander myself, I want my tax dollars to ensure that our kids are safe, our communities are safe, but most importantly, we're funding the crucial resources that are needed. And I want to go back to the mental health resource that I was referencing in the federal government's approach in the last administration, right? 988 is getting cut in funding and is being shut down. Actually going into effect tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, by the Trump Vance administration. And that's alarming because, again, mental health resources, they need to be accessible. But again, it's something that we don't often talk about in our intersectional communities, especially when we link it to things like gun violence, to suicides, to even violence inflicted upon others, right? And so, you know, with that being said, it's interesting because the state of Maryland is pushing new efforts to try to bring forth greater data and ensuring that guns are documented to ensure that we're actually taking the data in, but then we're able to match the correct response using our state and local government. And I commend our state leaders and our local leaders for pushing this. I really do. I hope that communities, not just nonprofit organizations, but again, fellow neighbors are able to get this information out so then that way we can help and play our part in providing this data. But most importantly, we're able to really lean on one another, especially as we're feeling the crunches of what this crazy federal administration is doing. And regardless of your political stance, I have to ask you something. Don't you think that our kids should grow up in safe schools? Do you think you should be able to walk down the street to the bus stop without having to worry about something happening to you? I think we all want that, right? And so we need to back our state on this 100%. Next, I want to get into the state hiring freeze in Maryland. Oh boy. So, uh, our state governor, Wes Moore, announced a hiring freeze. This is not only an effort to eliminate vacant positions across different state offices, but also to conduct operations to buy out some employees. So rather than just fire them, let them go, buy them out of their positions so they can find another job and they got bought out of that said job. But then also, like I said, freeze the amount of hires that are going on. Of course, it's a double-edged sword. It's good because you're able to somewhat regulate your fiscal budget, recognizing the budget crunch that we're in right now as a state of Maryland. But it's also bad because, we want more jobs. We want to put more Marylanders to work, and that's something that the governor said he wanted to do is create more jobs, especially in the state sphere. And I have to bring up, with the federal layoffs, the governor brought in, federal employees to work for the state government. How does this impact them? How does this impact the people who are already seeking a job? I know as someone who's young like me, I've always wanted a state job. But That may not happen in the foreseeable future for newly graduated individuals, right? Granted, I graduated in 2022, but still. And my concern, and I'm going to get to the reaction of lawmakers in a second, but my concern really stems from, from a perspective of narrative. And I say a perspective of narrative because I have a feeling that the party that is not in power right now, the Republicans, because the Democrats have a majority within the state legislature, both the House of Delegates and the Senate, as well as the governor's mansion, uh, going off the rhetoric of the budget and the fears, in quotations, of raising taxes, the fears of people losing their job. They're going to probably try to blame the governor and blame Democrats for it so they can take back seats in the legislature so they can somewhat balance the seat of power on their terms, right? And because keep in mind, the 2026 election is coming up very, very soon. It's coming faster than you think. And so this hiring freeze is going in from July 1, so tomorrow, 2025, going into June 30th of 2026. That's a pretty, pretty long time. A pretty, pretty long time, y'all. And that's going into the election cycle. So I'm curious to see how this is gonna, if this will have an impact on incumbent seats within the Democratic Party, or if the Republicans just won't get a footing in it. We'll see what happens. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Republicans are planning to use that rhetoric against their opponents. But at the same time, if I'm the Democrats, again, how are you uplifting your victories, but then how are you still meeting the needs of the people? How are you taking that bold stance? That's going to be very, very important because that's something that I feel like I hear a critique about a lot of the legislature in Maryland is that we're not bold enough in our approaches. We're not consistent enough in our approaches, right? Uh, and the governor said in his statement, and I'm pulling this article from Forbes, but he said that he's committed to engaging with our public sector unions as we work through these difficult decisions. We are moving with care and intentionality to minimize impact on current employees and be transparent through the process. Transparency is important, but timeliness is important as well. And I hope that the governor continues to balance those two things between transparency, consistency, and timeliness. But I'm curious to see how this is going to happen going forward. But it's interesting to see watching out. And so, to go a little bit more into depth about what these options look like in terms of this hiring freeze. First off, they're offering the buyouts. So, these are for employees, and I have to look into it again. But if I'm the governor and I made a decision like that, it's probably towards people who are about to retire. So then that way, it's like, okay, we'll meet you halfway. It's just a question of again the transparency part. That's going to be very important. I feel like people are going to be fearful, and this kind of goes back to the disinformation that might be put out by the Republican Party to try to mimic what it is that the federal government was doing in a strange way. Because I think the federal government was not transparent about their layoffs, especially with getting rid of positions, especially with these witch hunts. If you weren't pledging allegiance to Donald Trump, then you'd be out the door. But there wasn't transparency as to what that looked like, how that looked like. What does that look like in terms of vacant positions that are already in existence? I know the governor said he's cutting that out. But how are you going to stabilize and how are you going to balance your budget, especially when it comes to the offices that are operating your government? And it's your tax dollars, folks. So I'm curious if what services are going to get cut. I'm worried about higher education. In particular, state-funded schools. Will they have to downsize? I think that in schools, this is where student government and this is where organizations and unions and the staff and faculty senates come into play. And they're really going to need to play a pivotal role. Yes, you all are balancing so much as it is, but it's really important that y'all pay attention to what's going on because um, I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all. I think that state-funded institutions transparency has always been a question that has been at the forefront, and you have to ask to really get the clear answers that you want. Um, and so, we'll see what happens. I think that we will get through this as Marylanders, but it's really about controlling our narrative as the state and making sure that we're holding all of our elected officials, Democrat, Republican, Independent, you name it, accountable. And agencies, of course, that are being operated by those spheres accountable. Um, so, we'll see what happens. But next, I want to jump into something that we often don't talk about. Tenants, housing, and this thing called the Tenants Bill of Rights. Oh, it sounds fun, does it not? So here's a quick overview. This actually was a piece of legislation that passed and was signed into law. And I have a lot of good mentors, colleagues, and friends that actually push for this to happen. So Maryland has something called the Tenants Bill of Rights. And this particularly was important because uh, when we talk about housing, I think we can all agree that you should know what it is that you're signing on to, what it is that you are responsible for, but most importantly, what is the tenant responsible for, and ensuring that you're able to have safe, affordable, reliable housing, right? Unsafe housing should not be a negotiation. I've been saying that for a long time, right? And so with this, the landlords will be, have to they are required to provide a bill of rights to you every single time you lease. That sums up basically what it is that you need to know about your protections and about their legal protections, right? Why is this important? This is important because think about it. And I'll use a prime example. When you buy medicine or when you're looking at a commercial for medicine, what's the first thing? What's the thing that comes up at the end of that said commercial? It tells you the warnings, the side effects, right? Same thing on the bottle. It tells you all those things and more. And so that's very, very important because if you don't know what it is that the medicine can and cannot cause you, especially if you're not aware of your own rights, right? That could put you in a bad situation because recognizing prices are getting expensive. You're trying to make it out here. You may have a family, you may have things that you need to take care of. And so it's important that you know what their rights are and that you know what your rights are, right? And this piece protects you against discrimination, right? It protects you against retaliation. So they can't retaliate against you for exercising your rights, and you can't retaliate against them for exercising their rights, right? So, I know a lot of times people they'll be like, "Oh, well, my AC is broken, and you said you were supposed to fix it." They didn't fix it. They said, "Oh well, yeah, not anymore, Bucko." Right? But then it also guarantees right to privacy. And so landlords must respect tenants' privacy and cannot enter the premises without a proper notification. That's important because they can't just show up when you cooking breakfast in your drawers. That's not gonna happen, right? It also changes how eviction processes work. So landlords have to follow a specific process in order to formally evict you, right? And tenants are going to have the right to defend themselves in court. So if you feel like you're being unjustly evicted, you can take it to court now with protections from your state government. This is monumental. And people that are often against this piece of legislation, I would always hear they're like, oh, well, who's looking out for the landlords, right? It's not a question of giving somebody the upper hand. It's the question of reaffirming what it is that you are obtaining when it pertains to a service and making sure that you both are on equal footing when it pertains to the business that you are conducting for safe, affordable, and reliable housing. That's it. It's not rocket science. But let's be real, y'all. I mean, let's think for a second. I'm gonna give you 10 seconds. Think for a second. If you were renting and someone told you they were going to do something and they didn't do it, how would you feel? I'll give you 10 seconds. Now, if you were thinking for a second, you probably would not like that. You probably would be frustrated because, again, you pay all this money, especially when we talk about 1,100, 1,200, 1,300. Some people are even paying $1,600 in rent. And again, that's even I don't even think that's the max. I think people pay more than that. One of my friends said she paid 2,000. I said, goodness gracious, right? If they're not following through, you paying all that money for what? So you see why this bill is very important. This is going to be very important for young people because don't get me wrong, us as young people, we need to read our contracts better. But this is very important because we get greater protections. These benefits are more financially vulnerable communities, right? Because again, exploitation of finance happens, especially in housing, right? You pay all this money and you get little, but then your health and well-being is at stake. When we talk about mold, when we talk about bed bugs, when we talk about all these different things, right? So this is crucial legislation, and I'm glad that we were able to get this done. I got to give a shout out to my colleagues at NAACP. I know a lot of people have been pushing this from the mountains going all the way down to the shore. So I got to give you a shout out to y'all praises. let's keep it going though, because even though a bill is passed, it's signed into law, you forget we have to talk about the evaluation phase. We got to evaluate how this legislation is working. Because if it's working in some avenues but not the other, how can we go back to tweak it? How can we go back to make it better? And that requires us to talk to our legislators. Go on the link in my bio. If you don't know who your legislator is, hit them up, right? If it's working great, tell them that. If it's not working great, tell them that. Either way, talk to your legislature. They better be your best friend because guess what? You're paying their bills. Even though they don't make that much money in the state legislature, you're still paying their bills through your tax dollars. Let's get it. Let's go. All right. Anyway, next. Foreign policy. Whew. I'm gonna do a whole episode on this on Wednesday, so stay tuned because I want to really get into it about how what's going on in Iran and this crazy country we call Israel and our crazy country in the United States, how we're really about to make everything more expensive, but how we are really taxing our humanity. I keep saying this, right? Yes, we're the United States, but Donald Trump is clearly showing us that publicly we are still the bad guy. I mean, seriously. Not saying Iran does everything great, but at the same time, what are we doing? Like, literally, I'm 25 years old. Nobody's trying to go to war. And what I'll talk about in this episode very briefly is this whole back and forth between, Iran, Israel, Donald Trump saying that they're not going to beef no more, and then they start beefing some more. You know, it's very important that you understand that first off, the president does not have the power to go to war, just go to war willy-nilly, because there's something called the War Powers Act, right? That reaffirms, I say reaffirms the need for congressional approval when it pertains to a declaration of war. And that's important because what we don't often talk about is that this isn't something that happened when we talk about Vietnam War with Nixon, during Nixon's part of the administration, right, with the Vietnam War. This really goes back to 1787 when, again, you talk about Article 1X, Section 8 of our Constitution that gives Congress the specific authority to declare war against nations, right? Iran is a nation, right? And I feel like when I talk to people who support Trump or people who support what the Republicans are doing in this neoliberal approach, this whole war hawk approach of putting fists down, regime change, like Senator Lindsey Graham keeps talking about, right? They keep saying, "Oh, well, Obama, he did strikes in Syria. He did this. Nobody said anything." Actually, that's not true at all. I think of senators like Tim Kaine, who's a Democrat, who called that out, right? He called it out when Trump did that, I mean, in his first administration. So, really, this is a constitutional crisis again, because Donald Trump conducted several strikes using bombers in Iran to target their nuclear facilities because of his claim that they have and they are on the verge of creating a nuclear weapon. We've heard this story before over and over again, not just with Iran, but with other countries like Iraq. It's a Middle Eastern theme, it seems like. And it's crazy because then when they ask his security advisors, and they're like, actually, we haven't detected any evidence of such thing. They asked him that, and his response was, well, they're wrong. Huh? And so you did it anyway. Not only did you just escalate a situation where Israel was already poking the bear, they were already escalating matters, right? You had missiles being exchanged back and forth against one another, right? While Israel was also while they continued to violate human rights, especially when we talk about the Palestinians, which again we've been talking about in our previous episodes, no secret. Donald Trump does this, potentially plunging us into not only war, but into a series of unsafe environments where you have warnings going out to US citizens across the world and right here at home, right? Iran threatened to activate sleeper cells, right? I mean, you know, this is safety of the United States people, of the American people. And this guy clearly doesn't care. I mean, because if that's the case, then what happened to the nuclear treaty? He's talking about there's one being created in the next couple of weeks, but I don't believe that because if that's the case, then why did you say there was going to be peace while Israel was still continuing to send missiles? And then, of course, he was like, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what the F they're doing. I'm not going to cuss, I promise. But he said that on live television. You can look it up. It's crazy. But Senator Tim Kaine actually brought a bill forward to reaffirm the War Powers Act to give greater precedent and give greater boundaries. Yes, we're talking about boundaries, just like a toxic relationship from Congress and the president when it pertains to acts of war, declarations of war, etc. It failed in the Senate, from my understanding. But on Wednesday, we're going to talk more into depth about the history of this and how this escalated situation is going to impact not just your humanity, it's going to impact your wallet. Because just like we've seen in history before, when a country that has oil, especially in a port, closes it off, people start calling for regime change. Guess who was calling for regime change? And so we're going to talk more about that on Wednesday. Anyway, that concludes our episode of Meanwhile on Mondays in Maryland. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode. As always, remember to like, follow, subscribe. I'm out, y'all. Love y'all. Take it easy.